Why was she walking toward a place that had forgotten her? The sun pressed down on the California coast like a weight, not the gentle warmth of summer mornings, but something harsher, more unforgiving. The kind of heat that bakes asphalt until it shimmers, until everything looks like it's dissolving at the edges. Mara Vian had been walking for hours. Her boots, worn down at the heels and crusted with road dust, kicked up small clouds with each deliberate step. The frayed backpack on her shoulders bounced lightly, its contents rattling softly with a rhythm that might have been comforting if anyone had been listening. She was 34 years old. She looked older, much older. Life had worked her over the way time works over everything it wants to erase. Her hair tangled in the coastal wind, catching salt and grit. Her clothes had faded to colors that couldn't quite be named anymore, somewhere between gray and brown, between earth and ash. No makeup. No effort to soften her appearance or make herself palatable to the world passing her by. She just walked, eyes forward, moving with an efficiency that seemed almost haunting, like she knew exactly where she was going even if the destination made no sense to anyone watching. Military vehicles zoomed past her on the perimeter road, sleek, polished. The people inside never looked twice. Why would they? She was nothing. Just another broken thing the system had chewed up and spit out. Just another face that didn't belong in their world of order and discipline and pressed uniforms. She didn't hurry, didn't wave for help, didn't look around nervously like someone lost. She simply existed in that space between purpose and abandonment, walking toward something only she could see. The convertible came out of nowhere. Or maybe it had been there all along, and she just hadn't mattered enough to notice until it was too late. The engine roared. Tires screeched. The sleek sedan with officer plates swerved aggressively close to the curb where Mara was walking, so close she could feel the heat coming off the hood. She stepped quickly into the drainage ditch, her ankle twisting slightly on the uneven ground, just barely avoiding the side mirror that would have clipped her shoulder. The driver didn't tap his brakes, didn't slow down. A pristine captain in dress whites that gleamed like armor in the sun, his face turned away as if she didn't exist at all. Beside him sat a woman in expensive oversized sunglasses and a designer scarf that probably cost more than Mara had spent on anything in the last year. Maybe longer. The woman leaned out, her face twisted with pure disgust, like she'd just discovered something foul on the bottom of her shoe. In her manicured hand was a half-empty iced latte. For a moment Mara thought she might say something, offer some small acknowledgement of what had just happened. But instead the woman tossed the cup. It exploded against the asphalt inches from Mara's boots. Milky, sugary coffee splashed across her already stained trousers, soaking through the fabric and chilling her skin beneath. "Watch the road, trash." The woman's voice was shrill, sharp enough to cut. Her laughter peeled away as the car accelerated toward the VIP lot, leaving Mara standing there in the drainage ditch with coffee dripping down her legs. She didn't shout back, didn't curse, didn't even wipe the stain. For most people, that would have been the breaking point, the moment where anger or humiliation or both would have taken over. But Mara just watched the vehicle vanish into the heat haze. Her expression was unreadable, blank, empty. Except for one thing. For just a split second, her eyes tracked the license plate. The numbers and letters burned into her mind with a precision that would have been terrifying if anyone had been paying attention. A predatory focus that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with memory. The kind of memory that doesn't forget, that doesn't fade, that waits. She resumed her walk. The coffee dripped unnoticed from her pant leg, dark stains spreading across the fabric like ink in water. The base gate was ahead, close now, close enough to see the guards in their booths tracking her approach on their monitors. She could feel their eyes on her, assessing, judging, deciding what kind of problem she was going to be. The guards had noticed her 20 minutes ago when she was still just a distant figure on the perimeter road. One of them pointed her out to his partner, making some comment about drifters and addicts wandering too close to restricted ground. They'd seen it before. People looking for handouts, for attention, for some connection to the world of order and purpose that existed behind those gates. People who didn't belong. When she finally reached the checkpoint, they stepped out, blocking her path. Their hands hovered near their belts, not threatening exactly, but ready, professional, polite at first. "Ma'am, this is a secure facility. We need to see some government-issued ID." She stopped. The movement was so smooth, so controlled, it almost looked rehearsed. She reached slowly into her pocket, her hand disappearing into the faded fabric. The guards tensed, just slightly, just enough. But when her hand came back out, it was empty. She shook her head once. That was all. No explanation, no apology, no plea for understanding. Just that single shake of her head that said everything and nothing at the same time. That's when the radios came out. Voices calling for a supervisor because something about her unnatural stillness in the middle of all this chaos didn't sit right. Because people who were lost or confused or high didn't stand like that, didn't move like that. There was something else happening here, something the guards couldn't quite name but could feel in their bones. Inside the base, under a shaded canopy near the main administration building, Admiral Roderick Hale was wrapping up his speech. His voice carried that confident, practiced boom he'd perfected over years of public appearances and boardroom briefings. 58 years old, tall and broad, with rows of medals catching the light on his chest like a shield of honor. He talked about leadership, about sacrifice, about the burden of command and the weight of responsibility. He never mentioned that he'd spent most of his career in air-conditioned offices, far from any real danger. That detail didn't fit the narrative. The applause when he finished was loud and dutiful, cameras flashing, reporters jotting notes for the evening news cycle. Hale stepped off the stage feeling invincible, shaking hands, accepting compliments, his ego floating high on waves of adoration. One of his aides whispered about the minor situation at the gate, some vagrant causing a holdup, refusing to leave. Hale waved it off at first. It wasn't worth his time. But then something shifted. A spark of curiosity maybe, or a desire to show his hands-on leadership style. To prove he was the kind of commander who dealt with problems personally, no matter how small. "Let's see what the fuss is about," he said with a grin, striding out toward the entrance with a small entourage trailing behind. He figured it would make for a good photo opportunity. The benevolent commander protecting his base personally. The kind of image that played well in the press and even better in promotion reviews. When they reached the gate, the scene was already drawing a small crowd. Guards unsure of how to handle her. A few junior officers who'd followed the commotion. Reporters with cameras ready to capture any drama that might unfold. And there in the center of it all stood Mara, hands at her sides, not arguing, not pleading, completely indifferent to the weapons and the staring eyes. There was something about her stillness that felt wrong, like standing too close to deep water. Hale took one look at her. The ragged clothes, the dirty backpack, the blank expression of someone who had seen too much and felt too little. His grin widened into something predatory. He turned to the nearest reporter, his voice pitched loud enough for everyone to hear. "Well, look what we have here. You lost, ma'am. Or did you think this was the local shelter?" The laughter started small. A couple of chuckles from the officers who knew which side their bread was buttered on. But it spread quickly when Hale kept going, feeding off the crowd like a performer who'd found his rhythm. "We get all types trying to sneak a peek, but you really went all out with the costume. Is this derelict chic?" More laughter, louder now. The reporter, a sharp-featured woman named Alina who had been visibly bored with the earlier press conference, sensed something. A viral moment. The kind of content that gets shared and reshared until it becomes part of the cultural conversation. She signaled her cameraman to change the angle, framing Mara from a high vantage point to make her look smaller, dirtier, more pathetic against the towering steel gates. Alina stepped into the frame with a practiced look of concern that didn't quite reach her cold eyes. "This is perfect," she whispered to her cameraman. "Make sure you catch the grime under her fingernails. Viewers love the gritty details. Makes them feel superior while pretending to care." She thrust her microphone aggressively toward Mara's face, invading her personal space in that way reporters do when they've already decided on the story they want to tell. Tell us, is it mental illness or addiction that brought you to a military installation today? Can you even understand what I'm asking? Mara's eyes shifted slowly to the camera lens. The glass reflected a gaze so devoid of fear, and so filled with something cold and knowing that the cameraman instinctively took a step back. His tracking faltered, just for a second, but it was enough. Then came the first real physical contact. Major Nolan Fisk stepped forward, 42 years old, the base security chief, a man who lived in breath regulations, who saw the world in clear lines of right and wrong, authorized and unauthorized. He'd been watching the whole scene unfold with growing irritation, not at Hale or the reporter, but at this woman who refused to leave, who refused to explain herself, who just stood there like she had every right to be in a place she clearly didn't belong. "Ma'am, you need to come with me, now." He reached for her arm, not roughly but firmly, the kind of grip that says compliance isn't optional anymore. Mara didn't resist. She let him take her arm, let him guide her toward the security office. But there was something in the way she moved, something fluid and aware, that made Fisk's training kick in. A whisper in the back of his mind that said this wasn't what it looked like, that he might be making a mistake he couldn't take back. A young lieutenant whose name wasn't important enough for anyone to remember had been standing near the back of the crowd, 26 years old, fresh out of the academy, still trying to prove himself in a world that measured worth in rank and connections. He saw his chance, saw the cameras, saw the Admiral laughing, and he wanted to be part of it, wanted to show he could play the game. He stepped forward, pointing at a scar on Mara's forearm that was visible where her sleeve had ridden up. "What's that from? Bar fight or boyfriend?" His voice carried that cruel edge of someone who thinks cruelty is the same as confidence. But there was someone else in the crowd, someone who saw things differently. An old K9 handler, maybe 60 years old, with a face weathered by decades of service and a dog that had seen more combat than most soldiers ever would. His German shepherd, a veteran of 3 deployments, had been sitting calmly at his side throughout the entire scene. Well-trained, disciplined, the kind of dog that knew how to assess threats and act accordingly. But when Fisk had grabbed Mara's arm, something changed. The dog's ears went back, not in aggression, in submission, in recognition. The handler felt it through the leash, that subtle shift in weight and posture that meant something was wrong, or maybe something was very, very right. The dog whined softly, pressing closer to the handler's leg, refusing to move toward the woman everyone else was treating like trash. The handler looked at Mara, really looked at her, not at the dirty clothes or the tangled hair or the worn-down boots. He looked at her eyes, at the way she held herself even with Fisk's hand on her arm, at the complete absence of fear in a situation where most people would have been terrified, and he felt something cold settle in his stomach, a recognition that went deeper than logic or training. His dog knew. Somehow, his dog knew. But before he could say anything, before he could step forward and tell them to stop, to think about what they were doing, the situation escalated. Fisk pulled out handcuffs. The metallic click seemed to echo across the gate area. Alina's camera zoomed in. Hale's grin grew wider. "Let's document this properly," Hale announced. "Show the world what happens when you try to breach military security." Colonel Thomas Crow had been watching from a distance, 54 years old, base commander, a man who'd spent his entire career avoiding controversy, playing politics, keeping his head down and his record clean. He should have stepped in, should have questioned what was happening, but the Admiral was there. The cameras were rolling, and Crow had learned long ago that sometimes the safest thing to do was nothing at all. Mara stood perfectly still while Fisk secured the cuffs. She didn't struggle, didn't protest. She just waited, like she knew something no one else did, like she could see what was coming even if they couldn't. The security guard who'd first stopped her at the checkpoint pulled her backpack off her shoulders. It was heavier than he expected. He opened it, expecting drugs maybe, or stolen goods, or whatever contraband people like her carried. But inside was just old clothes, a water bottle, and something small wrapped in cloth at the bottom, something that rattled when he pulled it out. He unwrapped it carefully. It was a metal tag, old, battered, the kind issued decades ago before everything went digital. He held it up to the light, squinting at the faded numbers and letters stamped into the surface. They meant nothing to him, just another piece of junk from someone who probably picked it up at a thrift store or found it in a dumpster. But procedure was procedure. "I'll run this through the system," he said, walking to the security terminal, "just to be thorough." He scanned the tag into the military access terminal. The machine beeped, processing. The screen glowed its standard blue while the database searched for a match. Around him, the crowd was still laughing, still taking pictures, still turning this woman's humiliation into entertainment. Then the screen changed, from blue to red, a flashing, ominous crimson that meant something had been triggered, something beyond standard protocol. The guard's smile faded. His hand froze on the keyboard. One line appeared on the screen, stark, final, glowing against the display like a brand. Black Ledger, confirmed kills, 200. The silence that fell was absolute. Not the kind of silence that comes from people stopping to listen, but the kind that comes from people stopping to breathe. Every eye in the gate area turned to the screen. Then to Mara. Then back to the screen, as if hoping the words might change if they looked away and looked back. But the words didn't change. They just sat there, glowing, undeniable, 200 confirmed kills. What does that even mean? What kind of person carries a number like that? The question hung in the air like smoke, thick, suffocating, impossible to ignore. Hale's grin froze on his face, the expression caught somewhere between amusement and something else entirely, something that looked almost like fear. Fisk's hand trembled slightly on the cuffs. The young lieutenant who'd mocked her scar took a step back, his face going pale. Elena's microphone lowered slowly, her practiced composure cracking at the edges. The terminal beeped again, more information loading. The screen split into sections, each one filling with data that made the crowd gasp audibly. Names, dates, locations, operations that officially never happened. Missions where entire teams were listed as training accidents to cover up the impossible things required to complete them. The text scrolled past in a blur of classified designations and redacted details, but certain phrases stood out sharp and clear. Operation Silent Python. Extraction. Solo Asset Recovery. Site 0, Antarctica. These weren't just battlefields, they were ghosts, memories that governments spent billions trying to bury. And here they were, displayed on a screen at a base gate for anyone to see. A collective gasp went through the press pool when a timestamp appeared. 3 months ago. A date when Mara was supposedly living on the streets, linked to the dismantling of a terror cell in a location so classified the screen simply read, redacted, threat neutralized. The sheer volume of death and salvation scrolling past was dizzying. Names of operations, coordinates of missions, outcomes measured in lives saved and enemies eliminated. Each entry was a story. Each story was a nightmare someone had lived through and somehow survived. And all of them, every single one, carried the same designation at the bottom, executed by Agent M. Vian. Crow reacted first. His face went ashen, the color draining so fast it looked like someone had opened a valve. His hands clasped behind his back in perfect attention posture, muscle memory overriding conscious thought. He knew enough to recognize the classification level. Omega Black. The kind of designation that meant questions didn't get asked because the answers could end careers. Or worse. Fisk's hand froze on the cuffs. His eyes went wide with the realization of how close he had come to snapping a limb on someone who could have killed him 17 different ways before he even processed the threat. The metal felt suddenly heavy in his grip, like evidence of a crime he hadn't yet committed but almost had. Elena's camera zoomed frantically, trying to capture the scrolling text, but her hands were shaking too badly to keep the frame steady. This was still a viral moment, she realized, but not the kind she'd been hopping for. Not the kind that built careers. The kind that ended them. The young lieutenant stood frozen, staring at the screen as a specific file flashed past. Operation Sovereign Shield, 2014. The date hit him like a punch to the gut. His knees buckled and he had to grab the guard booth for support because he knew that operation. He knew that name. It was the mission where his older brother's entire squad had been pinned down in a valley with no air support, destined to die until someone had intervened. A ghost unit of one had cleared the enemy ridgeline in silence and vanished before the dust settled. His brother had spent years trying to find the angel of death that saved them, only to be told repeatedly that she didn't exist, that the whole thing had been exaggerated, that nobody could have done what the survivors claimed she did. Sterling looked at the woman he had just called trash, at the scar he'd mocked, at the silence he'd mistaken for weakness. Tears welled in his eyes as reality crashed over him like a wave. He was standing in the presence of his family's savior, and he had just spat on her sacrifice. More data poured out. The terminal seemed possessed now, determined to tell every story Mara had tried to bury. Missions and targets and outcomes measured in metrics that made trained soldiers look away. Then a new section opened, an appendix linking several high-profile operations to supporting intelligence, operations that had made Hale famous, operations he'd built his entire reputation on. Each one carried a notation at the bottom, tactical execution by M.V.N. Field Asset. Intelligence credited to R. Hale, Command. Hale staggered backward, one hand clutching his chest. The metals on his uniform suddenly felt heavy, accusatory, like they were made of lead instead of brass. "Impossible," he whispered. Turn it off right now." But the system kept going. The terminal had been triggered by something deeper than standard access protocols. Some failsafe buried in code that responded only to specific credentials. The live feed hijacked the base's broadcast system, sending the information to screens across the installation and beyond. Reporters who'd been streaming live suddenly found their signals boosted, amplified, pushed out to networks and websites with a reach they'd never had before. The truth was escaping, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Desperate to salvage something from the wreckage of this moment, Hale pushed through the crowd toward the terminal. His voice rose above the shocked murmurs, loud and commanding in that way he'd always used when he needed people to believe him. "I authorized this," he shouted. "Yes, she was my deep cover operative. I was testing security protocols. This was all planned. Everyone stand down." He lunged toward the biometric scanner, slamming his hand onto the glass surface to prove his authority, to claim ownership of her legend, to rewrite the narrative before it could destroy him completely. The system flashed crimson instantly. An alarm shrieked. Text appeared on the screen in letters so large and bright they seemed to burn. Biometric mismatch. Command overruled. Subject Hale flagged. Stolen valor. A high-voltage arc of static electricity snapped from the console. It caught Hale's palm dead center, the shock throwing him backward onto the asphalt with enough force to knock the wind from his lungs. The smell of singed hair and ozone filled the air. Smoke rose from his hand where the electricity had made contact. The machine had physically rejected his lie, not just denied it but punished it. A synthetic voice cut through the chaos, mechanical and cold, and utterly devoid of emotion. "Agent Vian, command authority restored." The words hung in the air like a sentence. Around the gate area, something shifted. Officers snapped to attention automatically, decades of training overriding shock and confusion. Crow saluted, his arm rising sharp and rigid despite the terror visible in his eyes. Fisk dropped the handcuffs, backing up with his hands raised as if surrendering to an enemy combatant. Even the junior enlisted who'd been laughing minutes ago straightened their postures, recognition dawning that they were in the presence of something far beyond their understanding. Mara's posture changed, subtle but unmistakable, her shoulders squared, her spine straightened. The weight she'd been carrying, that defeated slouch that had made her look broken and discarded, fell away like a costume she no longer needed. Her presence expanded, filling the space in a way that made the Admiral with all his medals and authority seem suddenly small, diminished, irrelevant. Hale struggled to his feet, one hand cradling the burned palm against his chest. His voice broke when he spoke, desperation making it shrill and ugly. "She's a killer." He pointed at her with his uninjured hand, the finger trembling. 200 lives, that's not service, that's monstrosity. You are a monster." Some officers shifted uncomfortably. Doubt showed on their faces. The crowd that had been so eager to mock her minutes ago now looked uncertain, caught between what they'd been taught to believe about heroism and what they were seeing in front of them. 200 kills. The number felt obscene, impossible, the kind of thing that belonged in fiction, not standing in front of them wearing rags and coffee stains. Mara met Hale's eyes. Her gaze was calm, terrible in its calmness. When she spoke, her voice carried no anger, no defensiveness, just fact. "You call it the peace you enjoy today." She didn't raise her volume, didn't need to. The words cut through the noise and chaos like a blade through silk. Simple, undeniable, the peace you enjoy today. How many people had died so others could sleep safely? How many monsters had been put down so children could go to school without fear? The questions didn't need to be asked out loud. They sat in the air between Mara and Hale like accusations neither of them could escape. The screen shifted again, new data loading. This time it wasn't mission files or kill counts. It was a financial ledger. Numbers appeared in columns, figures so large they seemed absurd at first glance. Agent VN pension and compensation, $4.2 million. Status, donated. Beneath it, a scrolling list of beneficiaries appeared. Organizations and foundations that helped the broken pieces the military left behind. Wounded Warrior Project, Veterans Homeless Initiative, the families of SEAL Team 4, Gold Star Wives, Combat Stress Recovery Programs. On and on the list scrolled, each entry representing money Mara had earned with blood and given away to people she couldn't save. The crowd gasped louder than they had at the kill count, because this hit differently. This was something they could understand in a way that classified missions and confirmed kills couldn't quite reach. She hadn't been destitute because the government failed her. She hadn't been wearing rags because she had no choice. She was on the streets by decision, by penance. She'd given every single cent of her blood money to the people who'd come home broken, to the families who'd lost everything, to the system that had used her up and never expected her to survive long enough to collect. While Hale stood in a tailored uniform paid for by tax dollars she had protected, she had chosen rags. While he collected paychecks for operations she had executed, she had given hers away. The contrast was so stark it felt obscene. Mara added quietly, her voice still carrying that terrible calm, 200 to save millions. The screen confirmed with projections. Statistical models showing lives saved, estimates running into 7 figures, terror attacks prevented, infrastructure protected, humanitarian disasters averted. Each of her 200 kills had been a calculation, a choice between one life and thousands, between mercy and necessity. And she had made that choice 200 times, had pulled the trigger or planted the charge or slipped the blade between ribs, knowing exactly what it meant. Knowing she would carry every single ghost for the rest of her life. What happened next came fast. Hale's own file flagged on the screen. Red text flashing warnings about credit fraud, stolen valor review, embezzlement of base funds. Military police appeared from the administration building, moving with the efficient calm of people who'd been briefed and prepared. They approached Hale quietly, professionally, their faces showing no emotion as they read him his rights. He protested loudly, screaming about his rank and his connections and the people who would hear about this, but they cuffed him smoothly. The cameras caught it all, every desperate word, every futile struggle, the fall of a man who'd built an empire on lies. Elena stood frozen, her microphone still in her hand but forgotten now. Her cameraman had never stopped recording. She thought she was capturing someone else's humiliation. Instead, she documented her own. The Black Ledger override had hijacked her signal, broadcasting the raw, unedited footage of her mocking a national hero to every screen in the Pentagon and likely beyond. Her phone began buzzing incessantly in her pocket, calls from her network producer, messages from colleagues. The kind of attention no journalist ever wants. She lowered her microphone, the color draining from her face as she realized she had filmed the end of her own career in high definition. Mara nodded once to Crow, a gesture so small it might have been nothing, but Crow understood. Command transferred, temporary authority acknowledged. He accepted it with a slight bow of his head, knowing he was lucky to still be standing. Lucky she'd chosen mercy over justice. She shouldered her backpack. The movement was slow, deliberate, like she had all the time in the world. Then she turned and walked away, the same direction she'd come from, back toward the heat haze and the empty road and whatever waited for her beyond the gates. The crowd parted without a word. A wide path of awe and shame opened before her, eyes following her every step but no one daring to speak, no one knowing what words could possibly be adequate. As she passed through the crowd, Fisk rubbed his wrists where the cuffs had been, staring after her with eyes that had seen his own death and been spared. The young lieutenant stood frozen, his career worries suddenly trivial compared to the weight of what he'd almost done. Crow exhaled slowly, already planning damage control that he knew would never be enough. Before she disappeared into the distance, the old K-9 handler stepped forward. He didn't say a word, didn't ask for forgiveness or offer excuses. He simply unclipped the expensive tactical patch from his uniform, the one denoting the base's elite guard, and placed it gently on the concrete pillar where she had stood. Then he snapped a salute, rigid, respectful. His arm shook with the effort of holding it, maintaining that perfect angle long after she had turned her back and could no longer see. One by one, the enlisted sailors joined him, the ones who did the real work and knew the real cost, the ones who understood that rank and medals meant nothing compared to what she had carried. They stopped what they were doing and stood at attention. A silent ripple of salutes tracked her departure down the dusty road, a tribute to the ghost who had walked among them and shown them what strength really looked like. The consequences came later, quiet but firm. Hale was stripped of rank pending trial. His face appeared on every news channel as the fraud was exposed, his carefully constructed reputation crumbling in real time. Crow kept his post but barely, his authority diminished, oversight increased, forever looking over his shoulder. Fisk was demoted after a review board cited gross mishandling of protocol. His career would never recover. Alina lost her network position when clips of her egging on the mockery went viral for all the wrong reasons. She became a pariah in the industry, her name synonymous with journalistic cruelty. The young lieutenant was reassigned to a radar station in the Arctic, as far from visibility as the military could send him. His friends distanced themselves quickly, unwilling to be associated with his mistake. But Mara, she disappeared back into the roads, no statements, no recognition sought, no interviews or book deals or attempts to capitalize on the moment. She never needed the spotlight, never wanted the medals they tried to give her or the apologies they offered. The truth had done its work. The ghosts had been acknowledged, and she had more miles to walk, more penance to pay. Because 200 kills, no matter how necessary, no matter how many lives they saved, still weighed on a soul. Still demanded payment, and she would walk until that debt was settled or until her legs gave out, whichever came first. Sometimes the world measures strength in medals and ranks and titles, in loud voices and confident declarations and the ability to command a room. But real strength walks quietly down dusty roads in worn-out boots. It carries weight no one else can see. It gives away everything it earns because the cost of keeping it is too high. Real strength doesn't demand recognition or respect or even basic human dignity. It simply endures, simply acts, simply walks forward even when every step hurts and every breath carries the weight of 200 ghosts. The Admiral laughed at a homeless woman because he thought homelessness meant weakness, because he'd spent so long in air-conditioned offices that he'd forgotten what real sacrifice looked like. He saw rags and tangled hair and coffee stains, and he assumed he was looking at failure, at someone who'd been broken by the world and had nothing left to offer. He never imagined he was looking at someone who'd carried the weight of millions, who'd made the impossible choices so others never had to, who'd walked through fire and ice and hell itself, and come out the other side still standing. 200 confirmed kills. The number sounds monstrous until you understand what it really means, until you realize that behind each number is a choice, a calculation, a moment where someone had to decide between one life and thousands, between mercy and necessity, between walking away or pulling the trigger. Mara made that choice 200 times, and each time she carried the weight, carried the ghost, carried the knowledge that she had ended a life, even if it meant saving countless others. That's the part the Admiral never understood, the part most people never see. Strength isn't always loud. Sacrifice isn't always visible. Sometimes the people who have given the most look like they have the least. Sometimes dignity doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand attention or respect. It doesn't need validation or recognition or applause. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.